And yet I ask you, is not an alien force already among us?
Welcome to Against the Grain, where curiosity leads the way.
Marco, thanks very much for joining me.
It's a pleasure, Gary. Thank you for having me on the show.
I was sad that we never got to meet up when I was living in Mexico City. The pandemic beat us, I think, didn't it, at the time?
I know. Well, hopefully there will be more chances in the future.
Yeah, I look forward to that. I definitely look forward to that. Okay, let's dive right into it. Atlantis, I've been watching some of your podcasts. I've been watching some of your presentations on YouTube. Let's start off. What got you into it, first of all? What got you into all of this?
Yeah, well, what
was the thing that drew you?
It's been a very long interest of mine since I was a child living in Italy. I've always been fascinated by ancient civilizations, by this question about the origins of civilization. I traveled very extensively since a very young age across the world, visiting Egypt, most of Europe, Asia, Southeast Asia, India, South America, and eventually landed here in Mexico, which is where I've been living for the past 8 years now, researching the question of the origins of Mesoamerican civilization.
Wow. So how long ago did it start? I mean, I know your book took, I heard you say it took 15 years to write the book.
Yes, 15 years of course, like collecting notes and consulting a broad variety of sources. I think my interest started in the field of archaeology, but then branched out into a number of related fields, from mythology, cultural history, even esotericism. So getting in touch with a number of different esoteric traditions, and then finding all these commonalities among traditions from all over the world that essentially speak about the same thing, this idea of a lost golden age, a lost advanced civilization of prehistoric antiquity.
So, okay, that's very interesting. Stories, because I'm very interested in stories myself. I think we are storied beings, aren't we? That's one of the things about human beings, that the way we respond to certain stories. I was watching a presentation yesterday by Jordan Peterson talking about the Jesus story and how much that sticks into the mind and how it represents an archetype to bring meaning to your life, that you follow this life where you fight the dragon, as it were, and you get the humiliation, you go through this life journey to get a transformation. Some part of you dies as some part of you is resurrected. He was talking about the story of Jesus in those kind of terms, and myths speak to us in those sorts of ways as well, don't they?
Yes. I think at the end of the day, what really gets us fascinated or intrigued is the stories. And Atlantis, I think, is probably one of the greatest stories ever told. The story of a mighty empire, the most prosperous, most advanced civilization that this world had ever seen, that then vanished, according to Plato, in a single day and night, just leaving this great mystery behind it.
And so the breadcrumbs of those mysteries that so many people know are these the pyramids in Mesoamerica, and the pyramids at Giza, obviously, that everybody around the world sort of knows about, the mystery of those. How did they get to build these things? What technology did they have? Because I watched a presentation podcast the other day with Joe Rogan, talking to Christopher Dunn, the engineer, and I always find it fascinating. I've met Robin Heath. I've met a bunch of people who are kind of engineers or surveyors who've gone out and looked at these sites like yourself, and come at it from a different perspective in terms of how it was made and then what its function was. And so you said you started off early on with archaeology. What sort of research have you done? Have you done any research in terms of the engineering side of it?
Yeah, for sure. I think that definitely the engineering question is a particularly fascinating one. I've always been intrigued by ancient megalithic structures all over the world, where you find very clear similarities in the construction style, the building techniques. For instance, you find in Egypt, in South America, in Peru, in Bolivia, at Tiwanaku, to some extent also in Central America, which to me really speak of a global seafaring culture. Now, just to be clear, I'm not arguing that all these structures date to the same time period. In fact, what you have is, even if you just stick to the Orthodox view, you have structures like the pyramids of Egypt. They were allegedly built in the 3rd millennium BCE, but then these are separated by over 3,000 up to 4,000 years from the Maya pyramids, for instance. So it's difficult in some cases to argue for a direct connection, a direct correlation between these structures. However, once you investigate what were some of the principles, some of the ideas behind the construction of these structures, that's where you find commonalities across civilizations that allegedly never had contact with each other, that existed continents or almost worlds apart from each other. And that is, to me, something that speaks of a common ancestor, a now lost civilization that influenced over thousands of years, possibly over tens of thousands of years, the development of civilization and culture on both sides of the Atlantic.
I mean, I remember hearing arguments years ago against that by archaeologists that, beavers don't have any contact, but they all build dams the same around the world. But that argument falls apart when you get into the deeper, like, for example, the geometry that's hidden within the structures, the commonality there, and where they are in relationship to each other over great distances, the proportions and ratios of that people have done research with. That kind of cancels out this idea that it just arose in consciousness in the ideas of these different populations who never had contact, doesn't it?
Yes, and that's where I think my personal interest, my personal quest into esotericism also began. Because once you start analyzing all these different mystery traditions, what they call a sacred science around the world, you very soon realize that it was based essentially on the same principle, this belief in a way about an energetic universe, about places of power, about harnessing Earth's energies down to the very minute details, like the symbolism that you find across these different cultures. Now, you can probably explain or try to explain away some of that by assuming that this was somehow invented or developed independently across the world, and that if you believe in this idea of like a shared consciousness, in some way all these different cultures were able to tap into this universal source of consciousness. But then you're still confronted with the evidence that it's not only the basic principles, but even the details, the symbols, the specific rituals, the ways they were carried out, that find very surprising analogies across the world. And so when you start getting into that field, which is more the field of the conventional, the specific symbolism that is adopted, then becomes clear that there must have been some type of direct influence, if not a direct contact between all these different cultures, so that these primeval knowledge at some point, and that's my belief, existed in one form or another in one place, and from there it spread throughout the world and continues to influence civilizations around the world even to this day.
So for example, like Graham Hancock's theory, where he says, that after the cataclysm, these people, emissaries, went from what was Atlantis and went out and kept the knowledge.
They scattered pretty much all over the world, and that's where you find also so many legends and traditions in places like Central America, South America, but not only there. You find very similar traditions in Egypt, even in Italy, in pre-Roman Italy about the arrival of these civilizing gods that came and brought civilization or restarted civilization in a way, because I think it was more about restarting civilization after the cataclysm.
What have you ever considered, Australia, and the fact that that civilization, the Aboriginal civilization, which existed for sort of 60,000 years, they lived by stories, Dreamtime stories, didn't they? No big monuments, as far as I'm aware, in Australia, like we see in the Northern Hemisphere with Giza and East Asia and Mesoamerica. How do you see the connection between those two different cultures? Because the story connection to me sticks out.
Yes, well, I think that, as you say, a lot of cultures like the Aboriginals of Australia, for instance, they have a very rich oral tradition, and literally for thousands of years, maybe for tens of thousands of years, there was the main, if not the only way of transmitting and communicating knowledge over time. Now, oral tradition tends to get looked down by modern archaeologists and anthropologists, who of course rely mostly on written documents, and in a way they tend to discard anything that may come from oral tradition as potentially contaminated or adulterated over time. But to your point, I think there is abundant evidence, even with cultures that we may consider like primitive in a way. I'm thinking about several of the like uncontacted tribes, for instance, still live in parts of South America, the Aboriginal people of Australia, some shamanistic cultures of Siberia, pretty much all over the world, who have a very rich oral tradition that again contains the same fundamental myths, truths, and stories that we find also in written accounts, in sacred books all around the world. I think as a civilization that is pretty much founded on the written word, we tend to discard anything that is not written down either in stone or paper as primitive. But just thinking about, for instance, the studies that were conducted back in the 60s or the 70s by Giorgio Santillana and the Herta Foundation in Hamlet's Mill, where they talk about the role of oral tradition and how oral tradition can actually convey very important scientific information. There's a specific case they were talking about the precession of the equinoxes, the repetition of certain sacred numbers in myths and traditions from around the world. And so I also do believe that to some extent oral tradition can also be a vehicle for scientific and knowledge transmission over centuries or thousands of years.
I agree with you. I think that I've thought about this quite a lot, and I think the sophistication of the stories, because that's coming back to this notion that we are storytellers and we are wired for story. And so, for example, plant knowledge in South America, they would have these songs which would tell them where to get the plants from, where to pick them, and the songs would be the stories that would have twists and turns, which makes us remember them. But I also think that they began to get more sophisticated with those stories, like poetry, where they could condense and the words and the meanings of the stories could become multivalent, so that there would be different levels of interpretation. There'd be one story or one song, but depending on the way that you're interpreting it, it applied to many different facets of life. What do you think of that?
Yeah, no, for sure. And I definitely believe that one of the advantages I think that oral tradition has over the written word is that it's very much alive. So it can be continuously enriched with new content. It can stay relevant in different contexts. But the core of it is what does not change. It is what gets passed on through the centuries, through the generations.
And so when I first went to really, when I started to investigate the crop circles back in 1997 and got to the area of UK where we've got our Stonehenge and Avebury and Silbury Hill and these monuments that seem to have been built by the Druids, possibly, I think Robin Heath has produced good evidence to show that there was a proto-Stonehenge in Wales and that the Druids came across. And I think the naming of all the hills in that area, similar to the Aboriginal Dreamtimes, the Ridgeway Path, that's about 6,000 years old at least, I think they sung up the landscape, and they had the song lines, which were the maps, like the Aborigines, which led them from Wales through there. But then this sophisticated thing with the Stonehenge. My teacher, when he took me to this area, said that these were like universities. People would go to them and they would experience them to study. So the principles of nature, of the universe, contained in these numbers, for example, which I want to come on to, that you mentioned in your lecture, they're all encoded within these things, so that as generations come forward. So it's a kind of a very sophisticated, looks primitive, but very sophisticated form of university, isn't it?
For sure. And I do believe that's the case with many ancient monuments, particularly with megalithic monuments, that they may have been used to encode certain kinds of information, whether it's in their proportions, in their basic measurements, their resonant frequencies. And this is something you find in Egypt. We can probably build a pile, just volumes of books that talk about the proportions of the Great Pyramid. They say that this concept of sacred geometry, but this is not exclusive to just one region or culture, because the same you find in Egypt, you find it in the Gothic cathedrals, for instance, in the European Middle Ages. You find it in Mesoamerica, in the system of alignments of the Maya pyramids, or even before that with the Olmecs, with Teotihuacan. So I think there is a lot of knowledge that is just embedded and coded in these monuments, and we are, I think, lacking the instruments to read them that were probably available to these ancient people. I think we're just, again, like going back to our previous point. I think we're only used to thinking of knowledge as a written word on a book. We're not used to think about the knowledge as something that can be encoded in stone construction, for instance, even though there is a very abundant evidence all over the world that has been the case for thousands of years.
Well, also the symbolic thing you mentioned earlier, symbols, as Jung's research shows, speaks to our unconscious more than it speaks to our conscious in a way. So there's this fulfillment of the whole of us, isn't there, rather than just this rational one part of us. So it seems that these, and so your proposition then is that all of this technology really grew out of a culture, an empire, which was Atlantis. The archaeological evidence for Atlantis, where it's located and stuff that has been proposed, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's really all over the world, and there are so many places in the world where we have not looked. Again, I do believe that this civilization originated in the mid-Atlantic Ocean. So I think that Plato, when he described a large island in the mid-Atlantic, was fundamentally correct. And I do think there is geological evidence, archaeological evidence, even botanical evidence, of course, a very broad range of scientific disciplines that was indeed the case. And from that center point, civilization spread to both sides of the Atlantic, and even beyond that to Asia, Southeast Asia, potentially to Oceania as well.
The one part that stuck out for me at the beginning of one of your lectures was you had this list of what Plato had down, some criteria. And one of them was as long as divine nature lasted in them. What do you take that to mean?
I think this is a theme that you find in so many religious and mythical traditions around the world. This idea that rather than an evolutionary process that took us where we are today, which is pretty much the mainstream scientific view of evolution and progress, it was in fact a descent into matter of a divine principle. So there is this idea that early humans were in a way more advanced, even though that does not necessarily imply more technologically advanced. They were more spiritually advanced because they shared into this divine nature, and then with the passing of time, a fall into materialism took place. And this is something you find, for instance, in Judaism, in Christianity, this idea of the fall, the original sin, this concept of a lost golden age that you find also among the Greeks, among the Mesoamerican civilizations with the legend of the sun, which is almost antithetical to our concept of evolution. We're not, in fact, progressing, we're degenerating into materialism from a more like divine or perfect state at the dawn of time.
And that's very Platonic, isn't it? That was his thesis, really. I watched there's a guy in England whose his name's William Keat, and he's been recently bringing up what he calls natural law. Okay, now I worked as a lawyer, and I'm very interested in the development of law and how laws govern society, and I became very interested in the jury system. Now, what's happened is he's been talking about the Magna Carta, which is located in Salisbury Cathedral, one of the copies of them. Now that was this. It's not it's the English Constitution, and it's quite esoteric. The charters are quite esoteric because they talk about the jury of any court where anybody's tried. Let's say the jury, in becoming jurors, they have the power to overwrite or rule against any legislation that's done by the collective. It's all about giving rights to the individual, okay? So that the individual has freedom of expression. Where my rights end, yours begin. And when you become a juror, you're really compelled to explore your shadow side. And society, by giving you the right of expression and by giving you the right of judgment by your peers in certain ways, causes growth in the person. So when I heard you say this divine nature, it made me think of that particular discussion that's being had at the moment about the English Constitution and about the way that government has sort of taken the power to be sovereign, as if Parliament is sovereign, which is kind of causing a dissent in a way, because individual rights, censorship and so on has been taken away. So do you think that this could be along the lines of what Plato was talking about?
I think definitely if you think about the philosophy of Plato as he expressed it in the Republic, for instance, certainly not a democratic philosophy. Plato was an aristocrat himself. Like his whole view about like politics, the ideal form of government, political system was essentially an aristocracy, like government of the better. And then, of course, like you need to define who exactly these like better are and what makes them better than the majority. I think that's the issue with a lot of these more like elitist type of system. But clearly, Plato was no fan of democracy. So I think there is a like political critique in there. But I think there is also something more subtle, and Plato also alludes to that. And he refers, as well as many other traditions, to an almost genetic interbreeding, like a genetic descent. So when Plato talks about this divine element that mixed with the human element, he's talking very literal terms. He's talking about the gods, Poseidon in this case, and the mortal element eventually taking over, which, if you think about that, is very similar, for instance, to the story we have in the Bible, in the Apocrypha, about the Nephilim, about the sons of God who had children and bore a progeny from the daughters of men. So again, like you find very similar themes across many different cultures that suggest that these descent, this degeneration, did not just have to do with culture or technology or materialism, but it had perhaps a more profound roots, almost suggesting that primeval humans were not only spiritually different than us. You may think like superior to us, but also genetically, anthropologically different.
Well, This is it, isn't it? This is where you bring about, as you say, the elitism, and then the notions of superior races, and the thing with the
which is I think a notion I want to like move away, because at the end of the day it always depends on how do you define exactly what is superior, what makes you superior. Exactly. The view that I present also in my book is that the Atlanteans were essentially not only a civilization but actually different, a separate human species. Now, when you're talking about human species, I'm referring to the likes of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and then, yes, you can argue, are we superior to Neanderthals? Are we superior to Denisovans? Again, it really depends on how you look at that. But I do think there was also an element there suggesting that these civilization also had a different like genetic makeup than modern humanity.
Yuval Noah Harari proposes that the reason that Homo sapiens became so successful is because of our ability to share stories and build collectives of cooperatives. The larger the cooperative, the larger the collective, then overtakes the race that doesn't have that ability. That's his proposal. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, I think definitely that's one characteristic that I think separates us from, well, at least as far as we know, like other earlier branches of the human family. At the same time, I think there is still so much that we do not know about our remote ancestors. Talking again about the Denisovans, for instance, now there is evidence. Andrew Collins, for instance, has done a lot of research in this sense, and Graham Hancock has also written about that. But if you think about it, the artifacts that were recovered in the Denisova cave, which have been dated to 70,000 years old, these definitely suggest a very elaborate way of thinking, clearly some sort of spirituality, and also, I would say, a level of technology far superior than what you find among pretty much any other hominin species that were living at the time, and perhaps even more than modern humans. I think also our picture of the remote past is quickly evolving, so we went to these idea of an almost linear progression from what was essentially Australopithecus, Homo erectus, Neanderthal men, down to anatomically modern humans. And now the picture got a lot more complicated. We found out, for instance, that anatomically modern humans interbred with Neanderthals, with Denisovans. And so what I'm arguing is, what if there is another, and maybe more than one, missing human species in that genetic equation, which you call Atlantean, that could have contributed a lot of what we presently identify as human, and that really represented that sparkle that triggered all this accelerated evolution that we have seen over the past 30 or 40,000 years.
Has there ever been any genetic sort of testing or anything to try and identify it?
I think there are a number of hints. Again, if we believe that the place where these human species evolved is now largely sunken landmass in the mid-Atlantic Ocean, of course, you would not expect to find a lot of fossil evidence. And at the end of the day, we're also constrained by the circumstances that lead to the conservation of these fossils. I think for very obvious reasons, it's a lot easier for these type of remains to survive in a desert, in a dry environment, such as you find in East Africa, for instance. It's much harder in a very humid environment like Europe or the mid-Atlantic island. But as you talk about like what is the genetic evidence, I point out to two things in my book. One is the diffusion of the Rh negative blood type, and the other one is the so-called haplogroup X. And these are both highly controversial topics. But if you look at the distribution of both of these traits, you find them pretty much equally distributed on both sides of the Atlantic, and there is no real explanation by any migration pattern, by any really genetic movement, at least during the historical period, that would explain how they came, for instance, to have a prevalence of haplogroup X among certain populations in North and South America, as well as in the Middle East, for instance.
The numbers, the processional numbers, 12, 72, 144, 288, 2160, 4320. Now we see these everywhere, don't we? We've seen it with the angles of the platonic solids, and the time, the way that we divide up the day and everything like that. This is all encoded as you present in the Mayan codexes and other places around the world. My interest in those things, when I began to discover them, was this reflection in consciousness. What we see outside, what we find outside in the universe, is obviously then resonating with something deep inside of us, like this Jungian archetypal geometry, numbering, etc. This sophistication, obvious, if that is the case, as I believe it is, the Atlanteans, if they did go out and pass out this knowledge, were obviously very keen to leave us a message in the bottle, it seems, doesn't it?
Yes, for sure.
They knew that there would be a descent.
Yes, and I think it has to do in part with like sacred geometry, so a fundamental understanding of the structure of matter, the structure of reality, that in a way they encoded in their monuments, whether deliberately or to serve some specific like functional purpose. But then you also have this idea of cyclical time that you find again across so many different cultures around the world, and it seems always to encode specific precessional numbers. It's almost as if they were trying to warn us in a way, or send us a message about the precession of the equinoxes. There's something important to tell us about the cycles of civilization on Earth, and about our spiritual evolution as well. I do believe that these great cosmic cycles, precession, maybe even some other unknown cycles beyond that, have very deep implications, not only on the physical medium, but also on our psychology as well over time.
So, for example, the Kali Yugas, the Hindu system of the Yugas, which we're in now, right? Or we're just leaving. We're just about to. We're going to leave soon. I think the Kali Yuga. That's we're in.
Well,
this
depending
period.
on your calculations, yes. I think people have been announcing the age of Aquarius for quite a long time, but
they have.
Sounds like we're moving farther away from it every day.
It seems so, doesn't it? So Randall Carlson and people like Randall, they seem to be saying the same things. There seems to be a body of you that come together and put forward this proposal, and you, as best as you can, lay down evidence where you can and say, this is where we're speculating, this is what we've got that sort of backs up it. And as you say, there's some genetic stuff which is highly controversial. Did you watch Graham Hancock debate with the archaeologist from Cardiff?
I must say I only watched
recently?
Parts of it. It's 4 hours plus long.
It's 4 hours.
So I've only went halfway
I did
through.
the whole 4 hours. I did. You watched bits of it. I watched the whole 4 hours. There were some parts of it where Joe Rogan was saying, I think we need to take a break and let's get a coffee, because they were getting heated. It was, wasn't it?
But great that I think both positions were represented, and we could see like both sides of the argument. I think we need more of these debates for sure.
I'm glad you said that. I think we do too, because this is where we can start to dispel the myth that there's a black and white, and that there's so much nuance to argument and debate, isn't there? Archaeologists have seriously opposed all of this kind of work, haven't they, for a very long time? And sometimes you can think, okay, on the one hand, we've just discussed a potential civilization that's felt it's so important that we get this information, that they've gone to all this trouble to go to various places around the world, impart knowledge to build technology to encode it, so that we now, or these generations that are just around us, can start to pick up this information. And then you have this whole body of academics, which are steeped in reductionism and materialism mostly, who work, it seems sometimes very tirelessly, to discredit anything people such as yourself put forward. What's your take on all of that? Because sometimes it seems extremely unreasonable, doesn't it?
My take, and having worked with many archaeologists and scientists, is that the vast majority of archaeologists are actually pretty open to that possibility, but they may not be necessarily like the most vocal minority. I think there is a very vocal minority in archaeology who tends to be extremely conservative and oppose pretty much any idea of progress. Of course, it's not surprising for a science that studies the past to be a particularly conservative discipline, but I do think it's not a majority of archaeologists. I found a great openness within the archaeological community to evaluate new evidence and new data when they emerge. But it takes time. I think if you go back to what is this idea of the structure of scientific revolutions, I think we're really on the brink of a new paradigm shift in the field of archaeology, and many more cracks, I would say, have appeared in this paradigm. Just only in the last few years, in the last couple of decades. Think about the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, for instance, what it has done, how much it has changed our view of the origin of civilization, of the evolution of complex societies. And this is only like a very small part of the world, if you think about that. My question is, how many more Göbekli Tepes are out there? We know so little. Think about that. 20 years ago, nobody had even heard about a site like Göbekli Tepe. And now you have dozens, maybe even hundreds of new sites that are constantly being discovered, are constantly pushing back the clock of the origins of civilization. We're only talking, again, about a very small part of the world.
I mean, I remember the kind of really serious arguments between Zahawi in Egypt with Graham Hancock back in the past, and the argument was always, well, if there is all this, where are all these sites? And then Göbekli Tepe turns up, and there it is, staring you in the face. And was it 1996, wasn't it, that the German researcher?
Yes, with Klaus Schmidt.
Klaus, that's right, yeah. And then a Karahan Tepe, and the LiDAR showing that there's layers of this
sites. Now there are over 20 of them.
So are you finding that archaeology, the archaeologists opening up around the world, or mostly in South America where you're currently working?
I think there is at least here in Mexico, in Central South America, there is a lot more openness to this type of possibilities. I would say also a lot more respect for the indigenous traditions, for, let me say, more the soft cultural components like the oral traditions, the myths. And I think that's an important part of that paradigm shift. It would exemplify that. Now, as you know, one of my big research interests is Mesoamerican civilization. The discovery of the Olmecs is still relatively recent in archaeological terms. Less 100 years ago, nobody had even heard about the Olmecs, and it took probably a good 40 years before the archaeological community actually recognized the Olmecs as a civilization distinct from the Maya and the ancestor of most later Mesoamerican civilizations. But you had the likes of Michael Coe, for instance, like really like brilliant archaeologists, authorities in the field of Mesoamerican archaeology, who still in the 1950s and the 1960s were still playing down the Olmecs as some sort of colonial Mayas, a post-classic later civilization that had clearly nothing to do with the origins of Mesoamerican civilization. So imagine the shock when radiocarbon dates came in and the Olmecs turned out to be a full 2,000 years older than the Mayas. And again, archaeological revolutions and scientific revolutions happen all the time. Now, when you're talking about this whole idea of a lost civilization of prehistoric antiquity, that's something pretty big to digest.
Yeah.
So I think it will take a lot longer before that becomes more mainstream. But again, I think all these cracks are already appearing. They're becoming larger with sets like Göbekli Tepe. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis also getting more and more traction. So I think the pieces of the puzzle are slowly but surely coming together.
And it's also, it's people such as yourself, incredible people like Christopher Dunn, who was on Joe Rogan the other day, who are calm, and they're not, because the form of censorship that's been kind of leveled at most people that have thought the alternative views has been that they're crazy tinfoil hat brigade, that are thinking the aliens have come down and so on. And when you actually put forward the reasonable things like you do, that helps, doesn't it, to appeal to the people that are rational. That's encouraging. I didn't really realise that you're the first person in a while that's told me that there's these dissidents amongst the archaeological community that are kind of happy to talk off camera and say, "Oh,
yes,
we've
yes,
got
you said it
issues."
right. They're happy to talk about that off camera.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Okay, so if we're talking to the lay person about all this stuff, there's so much information, it's so dense. Just thinking about it taking you 15 years to put all of this information together, it is digestible by somebody without academic knowledge who wants to put the time into to start to understand the ramifications of it. But what do you think is the way to how do I phrase this? How do you put the importance of this in somebody and say, look, it's important for you to know this because...
Well, I think two things. Number one, that's where we come from. So it's about understanding our origins, why things are in a certain way. And number two, I think our civilization is very much going down the same path. So there is a lot that we can learn from why this civilization that was so seemingly technologically, scientifically advanced collapsed.
So we can save ourselves with this knowledge.
I do think so. And again, I'm not going to talk about doom and gloom. I'm personally like an optimist. I don't believe in these apocalyptic prophecies about the end of time and the end of the yugas, the end of the cycle, and so on. But I do think there is a lot that we can learn from the mistakes of the past. I think there is this idea that our civilization, because allegedly and to the best of our knowledge, we're the most advanced civilization, at least technologically speaking, that ever appeared on Earth. We're essentially invincible, and we do not think about just how frail everything that we have built is, how frail civilization is. We take pride in, for instance, how interconnected our global supply chains are. But this is also, I think, a big reason for concern. Again, I always go back to this example. If you brought the top scientists on the planet well, I'm not even talking about the desert island. Let's put them in the middle of the Amazon forest. Do you really think they will be building computers and even something as simple as a light bulb within a decade? I think there is this question about what would happen if a truly cataclysmic event were to hit our civilization. Would we be able to rebuild from the ashes? I think there is a lot to learn from the struggle of the survivors, what I think were the survivors of these great prehistoric civilizations. They attempted to rebuild civilization and failed at doing that, because at the end of the day, part of the reason why we're here is that they failed at that. They had all the technology, they had all the science, and yet they failed.
It's a big story, isn't it? It's a really big story. Yeah. I mean, the effort that's been gone to, and we are the legacy of that failure right now. I mean, as you were saying that, then I was thinking, you said if we were dumped in the Amazon, would we be able to survive or build computers or re-emerge? I think people would struggle if they lost their phones these days.
Right. Well, and Plato himself talks about that in his dialogues when he says civilization has been destroyed a number of times, and every time the people who survive are not the cultivated people who live in cities and live a comfortable life. These are like the poor people who live in the mountains and and in the forest who know how to survive in this kind of environment. I don't think that many of us would survive if our grocery store were to shut down for more than 1 week.
Exactly. I've spent extended times in Brazil and West Africa, and particularly West Africa. When I first visited West Africa and saw how they survive, they definitely have the edge on so-called civilization.
Think about that. If truly a global cataclysm, I'm talking about a solar outburst or a cometary strike, as many suggest happened over 10,000 years ago, were to strike our civilization, most likely the people who would survive would be these people that we consider primitive, who live in the Amazon forest, in various like remote parts of the world. And maybe they will preserve this idea that once there were people who had flying machines and who had this globe-spanning civilization, maybe they will show like a rusty can of Coke to future archaeologists to prove that this civilization existed. And most likely it would not be believed. They were like, these are just going to be fables, myths.
Yeah, it's true. It's true, isn't it? That's why I struggle with seeing, in understanding why the archaeologists resist this so much, because so many people now, it's the Megalithomania conference in England, Hugh Newman has got the conference going on this weekend, so I'm going to be there tomorrow, catching up with everybody. And presentation after presentation, there's lots of people who turn up every year and they go on the tours with Hugh and Andrew and so on. So many people see it, but the archaeological community, as you say, have to say it off camera.
Sure. And they should be the ones to know best, because if you look back at even just at our recent history, not talking about the last 10,000 years, let's just look at the last 2,000 years, you realize that history is quite literally a cemetery of empires. So you have all these great civilizations that one day they were prosperous and believed themselves to be invincible and eternal, and then the next day they were just dust, essentially. Think about all these great civilizations, the Roman Empire, think about the Khmer in Cambodia, the Maya. From one day they were building pyramids and debating about the calendar and the stars, and then the next day their cities lay in ruins and they were back in the forest. So it's a pattern that we see throughout history for thousands and thousands of years. So this idea that we are the exception, that we're invincible, that our civilization is going to last forever, I think there's a lot of hubris to it.
Well, I see echoes with Rome, bread and circuses, overextending themselves. I saw Tucker Carlson say the other day that politicians are coming out of the train station in the United States at Capitol Hill, stepping over the drug addicts and the homeless people, their own fellow citizens, to go into Capitol, into the I've forgotten the name of the political building, to vote to send 60 billion to the Ukraine, convincing everybody that they're bringing democracy over there. That's what Rome was doing. They overextended themselves, the decadence and then they were distracting the public with bread and circuses. There's so many echoes, isn't there, of what's going on now
for
with
sure.
the empire falling.
That's probably the reason that there are all these memes about men thinking about the Roman Empire at least once a day, right?
So true, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the Greek in that sense as well, really. I mean, they bring us a civilization in some ways, but this transition between Socrates and Plato, this oral tradition to Plato, the writing thing, I've always found that very interesting as well. And I studied language and communication at university, and I did a Greek module on Homer. And what was interesting for me there was that the Troy story, and then the archaeologists going to look for the physical evidence for Troy, and that's kind of similar, isn't it, to what's gone on with your Atlantis? Yeah,
I think it's still very much like the big A word that nobody would say on camera, but I think that. Very much like the Troy story, these are like myths, these are stories that have a foundation in reality. It becomes even more compelling when it's not only a single source. It was Homer in the case of Troy, but you literally have hundreds of myths all over the world that speak about these great lost civilization, this lost golden age of antiquity.
It's very true, isn't it? Very true. So what you I remember when I was there in Mexico, you were talking to me about these tunnels. Have you done any more work on that? How's that going?
Yes. So since I've moved to Mexico now a few years ago, I started a research foundation here in Mexico to actually explore and investigate the question of the origins of Mesoamerican civilization. And one of the most important projects that we have conducted over the last few years has been a geophysical study of the archaeological site of Mitla in Oaxaca. It's been a major investigation, and I also want to be very clear that independent of what my personal beliefs, what my personal ideas about the lost ancient civilizations are, in no way these got into the hard science that's been done at Mitla and at those other sites where we've been conducting research in Mexico. So we partner up with rigorous academic institutions here in Mexico and internationally for conducting this type of research. The Mitla project in particular has been, I think, one of the most, if not the most extensive geophysical study ever conducted at the Mesoamerican site, with the objective of identifying possible subterranean chambers and tunnels. There are very old legends and stories that are very widespread in the area of Mitla and Oaxaca that talk about an extensive network of tunnels underneath the site. There are colonial documents that speak about that. And now we have, for the first time, geophysical evidence of the existence of these chambers and tunnels. We've now conducted 2 research campaigns at Mitla in order to map out the extent of this tunnel system. And what we have found is large chambers located at depths of over 50 meters, over 45, 50 feet underneath the ground. A very extensive network of tunnels going different directions, pretty much under the entire site of Mitla and possibly connecting the different structures. And this is a site that I think can hold many clues, many answers to the question of the origins of Mesoamerican civilization for 2 reasons. Number one, Mitla is the place in the American continent where we have the earliest evidence of plant domestication. So it's a sort of Mesoamerican Göbekli Tepe, if you want. We know that 10,000 years ago, 8,000 years BC, people were domesticating gourds, corn for the first time in Mitla. And the second piece of evidence is the megalithic architecture at the site. Mitla is a megalithic site. It has extensive megalithic architecture. It's probably the most important megalithic site, I would say, in all of Mexico and Central America, just based on the quality of the architecture, the quality of the construction. So very similar to what you find at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. You have this correlation between megalithic architecture and the origins of agriculture. And obviously, if you were to look for the origins of that knowledge, the best place to look for that would be underground. We believe that these tunnels, these underground structures that we have now identified may date back to the very origins of the site and may potentially hold important clues as to the identity of the people who first settled that area and brought agriculture into Mesoamerica.
Wow, that's really exciting. So what is the geophysical? So you've got tunnels, they're 50 meters approximately beneath. Yep. Okay. What makes you believe that they're connecting some of these sites together? What's the evidence for that?
Well, the geophysical survey, we actually employed 3 different geophysical methods. We use ground penetrating radar, we use electric resistivity tomography, and seismic noise tomography, just to map out the extent of these tunnels. And what all these three methods show is that these tunnels actually connect to each other. They extend in different directions. There are probably several chambers. Now, what we do not know is whether these are natural or artificial. There is, of course, a possibility some natural caverns were repurposed at different points in time, which, again, would be something fairly common. We find it throughout the world. However, some of these tunnels and chambers, just because of their configuration and their shape, they look clearly artificial. Now, if you're talking about some of the largest chambers, one chamber in particular was detected underneath the church, would measure over 25 meters long by 12 meters wide, and this is located at a depth of 15 meters below the ground. Now, to build a chamber like that, assuming that it is artificial in origin, we have a very strong reason to believe that's the case. You will need some pretty huge capabilities, technological capabilities to conduct an excavation at that depth. There's also evidence that enormous megalithic stone blocks were employed for the roofing of these chambers. This is something we find in some of the tombs that are accessible. Admittedly, there is only a handful of these subterranean chambers that are accessible. They're fairly small and of late date, but clearly what they tell us is that the ancient builders of the site did not trust the rock itself. It's not a very good quality rock, and so they brought in these huge megaliths from quarries located up to 10 or 15 kilometers away to roof the chambers. And we do believe, just based on the geophysical survey, that some enormous megalithic stone blocks, probably 12 to 15 meters long, were used for roofing this chamber. We have found actually a few of those in the quarries around Mitla, which is possibly the largest megalithic stone block in the entire American continent. It measures over 12 meters long by 4 meters wide. So it's smaller, slightly smaller than the Baalbek stones, but it would still weigh over 400 tons. And we have evidence that even larger stones were employed for the construction and for reinforcing the subterranean chambers. Of course, we do not know what these chambers may contain, but there is the belief among the ancient Zapotec people that Mitla was an entrance to the underworld. That's the place where they had their most sacred temple oracle dedicated to the gods of the underworld. And we have Spanish accounts that actually talk about how Spanish priests in the 16th centuries went down into this subterranean labyrinth. What they describe is huge hallways, massive rooms supported by pillars, and this maze of tunnels and chambers all around the site. They were used as tombs by the local priests and kings, but quite possibly also had a connection with these ideas of the underworld, which makes us think there may be something even more ancient there at Midland that the Zapotecs somehow just reused or repurposed an already existing subterranean complex.
What's the next step then? So you've done the geophysical. Yes. Is there going to be any digs now then?
Well, at this point, there was also a National Geographic and New York Times article about the findings from the first season. Last October, we concluded the second season of the geophysical survey. With that, we have a pretty complete map of everything that may exist under the ground of the site. So the next step would be to actually drill potentially into some of these chambers. What we are proposing is a non-invasive type of study prior potentially to a future excavations, which would drill a relatively small hole, probably insert a camera. Now, the depth at which these chambers are located makes these technically complex. So we'll need to study what's the best way for conducting this type of study, granted that some of the entrances to this tunnel system may be far more superficial. And so that also another avenue of research that we have, just identifying these access points, and then it is accessing those initially with a camera, maybe with a robot, and then in the future potentially with a more comprehensive excavation.
Wow. Who's funding it?
We are funding it in a way. So it's a group of people here who are very interested in this question of the origins of Mesoamerican civilization. So the whole venture is privately funded, but of course conducting in partnership with the National Autonomous University of Mexico and the National Institute of History and Anthropology.
Fantastic. So what sort of time frame are we talking before we can potentially put a camera down there?
Well, that's a really good question. I think the geophysics was relatively easy because it's completely non-invasive, non-destructive. And when we're talking about drilling, particularly at that depth, which some of these chambers appear to be located, that would involve bringing in some pretty heavy equipment. So we need to evaluate from just like a safety, security point of view, from also a technical point of view, how we could conduct this type of research. The issue with Mitla is that it's a pre-urban site. If you have been there, you know that the ruins sit pretty much in the middle of town, so there is not a lot of space where you can bring in this type of equipment. So I think it's a matter of identifying what would be the most promising points where one could like drill down to these chambers. How do you reach them? And then identifying some potential access points for future excavation.
Oaxaca's quite unique, isn't it, in Mexico? As far as I'm so gutted that I never got to go there because of the pandemic. But they have their own kind of rules there, don't they? How are the local people
yeah, there is still a very active. I would say like. The indigenous traditions in Oaxaca are still very much alive with the like Zapotec people. It's quite incredible, but that's a culture has been surviving in a way or another for the past 3,000 years in the area. And of course, and reasonably understandably so, these people are very protective of their heritage, their tradition. So also in a site like Mitla, we've had lots of people who support this type of research and excavations, but also lots of people who would better let it and leave it where it is under the ground. So I think that's also an aspect to consider, just the sensitivities of the local community. And
Absolutely.
I think we've been doing like very important work also with communicating those findings, building engagement with the local community for just understanding the importance of these finds and also helping in their conservation and communication.
Yeah, the tradition's rich there. So do you see any connection between, I mean, there is a connection, but I mean, how do you frame up the connection with the psychedelic plants, the use of it, the Maria Sabina, Oaxaca, the laws that they've got there, and the ancient civilizations, the remnants of it? How do you see the connection?
Yes, it's maybe not as much in that area of Mitla, Monte Alban. It's more like towards the north of Oaxaca in the Sierra Mazateca. But even at sites like Mitla, like Monte Alban, I think there is very strong evidence that hallucinogenic plants or psychoactive substances were employed to create altered states of consciousness. Essentially. So I think there is a possibility that particularly these subterranean spaces, like you see also in South America, places like Chavín de Huántar, were used as part of some psychedelic rituals or initiation ceremonies that happened in these subterranean chambers, in these like labyrinth or maze-like tunnels.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, and the recent work with Brian Morescu, who did the work at the Oracle in Delphi.
Yeah,
exactly.
Book.
Fascinating book. Really good piece of research. I mean, really, really good. These things are coming together, aren't they? And that's another thing that we see spread across cultures, is this relationship to these power plants or teacher plants, as some of the people go. I did an ayahuasca ceremony before I left Mexico. I had a shaman come to my house. I was living in Desierto de los Leones, up in the forest, and I had a shaman come, and me and a girlfriend spent the night doing ayahuasca. That was a character building experience, Marco.
I believe that.
Look, it's been fantastic to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining me.
It's been a pleasure.
I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks so much. Is there anything else, links or anything else you want to point out to
Well,
anybody
just
that might be
talking
watching?
about some of my recent research, I mentioned Mitla in Oaxaca, another very important site where through this archaeological association, of which I'm the president right now, the ARCS project, we've been conducting research. It's a small site in the south of the state of Mexico called San Miguel Ixtapan, where over the years a large number of megalithic carved stone slabs have been unearthed that bear a very strong resemblance to South American stonework. So you have these massive megalithic stone slabs. Some of them are over 3-5 tons in weight. They're almost perfectly carved with very precise right angles into precise geometric shapes, very similar to what you find, for instance, in Peru or in Bolivia at Tiwanaku, at Pumapunku. Most of these slabs have been found out of context, meaning like reused in later structures. There is evidence that they were reused in what is called the Epi-classic period, so around 700 CE, by the local inhabitants of the site who built some pyramids and incorporated some of these slabs in their structure, which strongly suggests that their origin must be much older than pretty much anything else that we find at the site. And we've been documenting over 2 dozens of these stone slabs, again, very precisely carved. They're carved in a style that I've never seen anywhere else in Mesoamerica. There is pretty much no research at all on the subject of these slabs or their origin. And so we're now planning a much more extensive exploration research campaign that may potentially include some excavations, some stratigraphic excavations at the site to understand, first of all, the chronology of these slabs, which I believe must originate in the pre-classic. They may be contemporary, maybe even earlier than the Olmecs. And number 2, understanding their mineralogic composition. They seem to be some type of a very hard, finely grained basalt and andesite, so a very hard type of stone. There are still many questions about their exact composition, where the quarries were located. So there is a lot more research that needs to be done at that site. I've recently released a video documentary about our finds in San Miguel Ixtapan that include many of these megalithic carved stone slabs, include some monolithic polished columns, a number of other very, very mysterious, very enigmatic stone artifacts at the site, which I believe is also one of those sites that may help push back the origins or the chronology of Mesoamerican civilization, possibly to a time earlier even than the Olmecs.
Really? And is that documentary on YouTube?
Yes, yes, it's on YouTube.
Yeah. Okay, you send me a link for that.
I will
I'll put this in.
I will,
in
for
the
sure.
description. Yeah, that'd be fantastic. Fantastic. Okay, Marco, thanks so much for joining me.
It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure, Gary. Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much.